In this video about trackwork design, we'll be covering staging yards, trackwork for industrial sidings, how to create realistic curves by the use of curve easements and hyper-elevation.
Hello and welcome to a video tutorial in which we'll talk about track planning. Yeah, during the high season of model railroading, which for me is in, between November to, I would say, March every year, I get tons of questions about, hey, here's my track plan, what do you think? Should I change something or what do you think? And yeah, I try to respond to everyone, but there's a lot of thoughts going into a track plan, so just to give a quick feedback is not really possible. You have to understand what the creator have had in mind when they laid out the tracks and did all this. So a track plan, okay, it says something, but most often not enough. So I typically recommend a consulting hour instead, then they will have much better feedback on their track plan. Or to post it in a forum, preferably one of those thread-based web forums where actually people can respond and give proper feedback. But anyway, in this video we're going to talk about good and bad track combinations, because there are some fundamentals which everyone should be aware of, plus storage of trains, which means shadow stations, Schattenbahnhof, staging yards, etc. It's all the same thing basically, but it's very important in a model railroad track work design. So let's get started.
Alright, so first there are some really basic things you should be aware of when planning your sidings. And one of those is the double S-curve. This type of solution typically leads to derailments from a wide variety of rolling stock and should be avoided if not necessary. Instead, you can make it like this. So instead of a right-hand turnout, you go for a left-hand and continue the curve it came out of until it straighten out on the siding, or if it's the main, continuing there. This way you have reduced the double S-curve to a single S-curve. Now there are even better solutions to achieve the same thing, and that is by using a curved turnout in the curve which leads into this straight section, and thereby not creating any S-curves at all. However, curved turnouts are not very common in the prototype, and if you care about that, then curved turnout is just the second best. The best thing is actually to have a standard turnout, a left hand in the middle of the curve like this, and this way you still have a prototypic straight turnout and you avoid all the S-curves. The questions I get commonly refers to sidings, which leads to industries, and the most basic design for that is this: the loading track attached directly to the main line. This has several disadvantages. You cannot change the order of the cars on the loading track. You have to occupy the main line all the time when making movements. So this is a much better solution instead, and it doesn't take up more space either. You create a yard lead to where you can pull out cars and change consist. On the yard lead you typically have a switcher standing, and thereby you can handle all the cars on this loading track for the industry. Now if you want and have room also on the other side, you can add another loading track. So now you have one track for loading and another track to store like empty cars or loaded cars, which are either going out or going in. So there you have separated loading cars from storage cars. Now to make this even more flexible, you can have a runaround track in the end of these. So you bind these two loading tracks together, and by having a switcher in this industrial yard, you now have quite good flexibility for car movements within the yard area. Another very useful amendment, if you have room for it, is an arrival and departure track. So when the arriving freight train comes in, they drop off all the cars there, and from there you can handle the cars with your switcher. The arrival and departure track should ideally have the same length as the longest freight train. Alright, so let's have a look at the train storage and tracks for train storage. In the US, this is called staging yards. In Germany, it's Schattenbahnhof, and here we call them shadow station. Anyway, I think this is a good solution for the track work in a shadow station, because all the tracks have the same length, which vastly simplifies storage of your trains. You never have to think about, oh, what length did that track have, etc. In this case, they all have the same length. And if you want to store shorter trains from the branch line, for instance, well, then you can divide one of these into 2 blocks, and voila, you can store 2 trains in line there. Now, another thing you can do is adding these blue tracks on the outside. Thereby you can stage extra long trains there. So, you know, there's always a it's fun to run really long trains sometimes, and then it's also a good idea to have tracks so you can store them. A staging yard like this can either be fitted in the room next door, the Americans typically have that, or you can have it underneath your layout, not visible, or you can have it as a yard fully visible on top, or as a vitrine section. So there are a lot of options for storing trains. Now have a look at these curves which leads up to the station. They are both banked, which is called hyper elevated, and they also have something in the beginning and the end called curve easements. These two things vastly improves the appearance and the realism of your curves. Now, if you're building with sectional tracks, you have limited options doing this. One thing you can do though is to use the tighter radius inside tunnels, and while exiting the tunnels you go to a wider radius. This both gives a more realistic appearance of the visible part of the curve, and also improves operational realism when going from straight to curved section. So when using sectional tracks, you have to get used to that the train kind of crashes into the curve. And this because there's no transition between the radius and the straight section. Let me explain the difference here. This is a fixed radius curve, so it completes a circle. But if we put some glue in here, it will wind up on this screw and create a spiral curve instead, and this will not have the same radius anywhere. So when laying the tracks, use your yardstick to create the fixed radius curve. The fixed radius curve you draw should be offset by the radius divided with 64 for the spiral curve transition. And then add some nails along that straight line. Insert a thin wooden stick and then bend it until it aligns with the curve you just draw. And you have now created a spiral-shaped transition between the straight section and your fixed radius curve. With that done, you can now start to lay the tracks. And look at this passenger car, how smoothly the bogies transition from the straight section into the curve. And what about this hyper elevation then? Well, I typically use pieces of strip styrene, and for HO scale I found that these, which are a 1/4 millimeter thick or 1/10 inch, gives sufficient elevation. Start by dividing your curve into sections, and once determined how long the curve is, then you add some super glue or fast set glue onto some of the ties and glue these styrene strips in place underneath. And with that done, you can assemble the tracks like you always do, with whatever adhesive and ballast you like, because both the elevation and the strip styrene will be hidden under the ballast. And even though we used quite a moderate amount of elevation on the other rail here, you see that there's a distinct look of banked curve.
All right, so I hope you have use for this information provided here about the track planning. And I mean, this is nothing new. It's been around since, I would say, the 50s or something like that. So 70-year-old information. But for every new track plan, you have to think about this because it's a good way to avoid problems once all the tracks are laid out. And you know, have to redesign things like that. So it's really a good information, and I hope you have use for it and something to take back when you make your next track plan. So thank you very much for watching this tutorial. If you have use for the information provided, and if you like the content on the channel and watch it regularly, why don't you support it? Get over to Patreon, set up a support account there from, you know, like $1–2 per month, or make a one-off donation using the PayPal dialog found in the video description below. And if you have not yet subscribed, subscribe to the channel and enable that little bell next to the subscription button, and you will get a notification once a next video gets published. Until that happens, see ya.